Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. In this video, I'm walking you through the entire pipeline of modeling, unwrapping and lazily texturing a stylized cartoony dragon coffee maker. I'll be modeling in 3ds Max 2024, unwrapping in both 3ds Max and Rizom UV, and texturing in Substance Painter. No hand painting involved here. I'm keeping it simple with minimal plugins, just the loop regularizer script for 3ds Max and the weighted normals modifier, which is now built in Max. You can also use rapid tools to spherify some orifices if you want to go that route. The video is sped up 6 times, compressing a roughly 3-hour process. The duration was extended due to experimenting with various blockouts and color schemes without a reference image, done off camera. To follow along, you can mute the sound, slow the video, and use subtitles for narration. I don't cover basic techniques, so some experience is helpful, though no advanced methods are used. If you like my videos, please be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. Let me dive into some details. This model is a spontaneous concept that popped into my head. I stumbled across AI-generated dragon coffee machines on Google, but they were pretty awful, so I decided to create my own version. I didn't optimize this guy at all, and skipped baking a high poly version to a low poly one, which is why the model sits at a hefty 7K polygons. For a non-hero static prop that isn't the focal point, 7K polys is definitely on the higher side. Most non-hero props typically range between 1K and 5K polys, depending on the platform and the game's art style. If you are modeling a similar prop, 7K polys might be justified if intricate details add to its charm. That said, you'd probably want to optimize further. Ask yourself if those polygons are necessary, or if you could achieve the same look with normal maps and textures. My dragon is rocking a 2K resolution UV map with 16 pixel padding. For non-hero non-interactable props, think background or environmental elements, players won't usually see them up close. If this coffee maker is a distant or minor set piece, a 2K texture is overkill, since the detail won't be fully appreciated. A 1K texture, or even less, would likely suffice, especially in stylized games where textures prioritize bold, readable designs over realism. The main body and neck have 16 sides, which means the tower has 8 battlements, a lot. Reducing it to 14 sides and 7 battlements wouldn't change much visually, but would help lower the poly count. The dragon's neck has a ton of supporting edge loops to maintain its curvy shape, and I didn't trim them because they are crucial for the look I wanted. To cut the poly count, we could remove one of the 4 sharp spines from the dragon's back. Each loop adds at least 16 new vertices. Even with a 16-sided body, we could introduce some trees and reduce the next side count to 12 or 10. Surely we could have made the tower, base and neck more angular, but that would compromise the concept's vibe. As I've mentioned, a manual retopology pass could easily bring the poly count below 5K, at the very least. Here's a breakdown of the side counts for other cylindrical elements. Tees, 6 sides each. This is fine, but 5 sides could work just as well. Nose sides, 16 sides each, way too much, 10 sides max would be more appropriate. Eye stalks, 16 sides, definite overkill, 10 or 12 sides would do the job. Hose, 8 sides, which is solid. Horns, 12 sides each, dropping to 10 would save a ton of polygons, especially with all their supporting edge loops. Cup, 16 sides, also a bit much for something so small, 12 or 14 sides would be plenty. Button, 16 sides, again 12 would be more reasonable. The model is split into 3 objects, the coffee maker, the cup and the button. The button is purely cosmetic, not pressable and not designed for animation. The back scales were created as NURMS objects, each with 16 sides. Honestly, that's a bit overkill looking back. We could have easily simplified their topology, dropping the side count to something like 8. Since they sit on the back of the model, we don't even know if they'll be viewed up close. If they are not, we should definitely shave off some poly count there. Technically, we could remove 1 out of 4 scales and cut their supporting edge loops in half to save even more. I used the ProBoolean tool to attach them to the rest of the model. A quick tip: make sure to detach any intersecting parts before using ProBoolean, then reattach them to the model once you're happy with the topology. Reducing the scale topology by half would eliminate many supporting edge loops from the neck, saving approximately 16 vertices per removed loop. To maintain clean geometry, I minimized the use of triangles, keeping everything symmetrical. I add supporting loops by holding the Shift key and connect them to the desired vertices for seamless integration. At this point, you may want to surround each scale with a circular loop of near-square polygons to ensure optimal shading. I also chose to give each intersection a single chamfer, the 3-edge one. At this stage, you can decide whether to skip chamfering rear objects entirely, as they'll be hidden from you, apply a single chamfer, or bake a turbo-smoothed or sculpted high-poly model onto the low-poly version. Alternatively, you can paint chamfers to reduce poly count while maintaining visual detail. After adding scales to the spine, I adjust surrounding vertices with the edge constraint function enabled to maintain clean topology. Ensure proper shading by checking from multiple angles. Round intersections look best when surrounded by a single loop of near-square polygons. In hindsight, two vertical supporting edge loops could be consolidated into one by inserting a new edge loop between them while holding the Shift key, then removing the adjacent loops to optimize the topology. The head relies heavily on flat surfaces, which work great and let us attach multiple objects easily without worrying about angles or shading issues. I tweaked its shape slightly using the FFD modifier, and then cleaned up the shading with the weighted normals modifier. The head's platform hosts a bunch of teeth and other attachable models, so a flat design feels like the optimal choice. Looking back, I added way too many supporting edge loops to the rear part. A single chamfer on both rear sides would have been much smarter. The head's pivot point is set to its rotation axis, aligned with the attachment points that allow the head to rotate. We don't want the head sitting perpendicular to the body's main axis. Instead, we should lift the chin slightly to avoid an unnatural angle. That said, don't rush to adjust this before attaching all other elements to the head. The flat surface of the head gives us the freedom to choose any number of sides for attachable models, a great opportunity I overlooked here. One piece of advice: avoid creating overly stretched polygons or placing vertices too close together. Spread them out a bit and consider surrounding each orifice with a circular loop of near-square polygons. Modern game engines handle angles pretty well in most cases, and poles aren't too noticeable on flat surfaces, especially since we're polishing everything with a weighted normals modifier. Still, I prefer to work with near-square polygons, adding some trees on flat surfaces where they won't impact shading. I applied a single chamfer to both sides of the cylindrical openings. In hindsight, this was inefficient, as both sides are obscured by the horns and other model elements, making the chamfers unnecessary. Most intersections occur on flat surfaces, so shading issues are minimal. The weighted normals modifier effectively conceals any visible shading artifacts that might arise. As a result, creating multiple triangles here is not a concern. I also add a section to the dragon's body by simply extruding all of its components. Make sure to leave its general curve intact, and also remove all the unwanted geometry. When fixing the rear side's topology, I surround each circular attachment with a loop of near-square polygons and shift some vertices around with the edge constraint function enabled. This helps me distribute vertices evenly and make the polygons as close to square as possible. Since this model isn't a hero asset, it's not meant to move much. The next poly count could have been reduced as long as its curve stays intact. The remaining technical details got a single chamfer, but honestly, this could have been skipped since they'll be hidden later by the dragon's horns. Add an extra support loop and widen the dragon's jaw just a little bit with the FFD modifier to add some curves to his cheeks. Just make sure you don't mess with the triangles we have created earlier. The eye stalks are created as loft objects with an excessive 16 sides, which is inefficient. They could have been optimized to 10 to 12 sides, transitioning smoothly into 16-sided lamps. However, the current design is what we have. The curvature of eye stalks mirrors the dragon's body, creating a cohesive look. I kept the eyes symmetrical, but you can break symmetry by adjusting each stalk's trajectory and varying eye sizes for a more dynamic appearance. The eyes are crafted from hemispheres with the same edge count as their surrounding geometry. I start with 16-sided spheres, split them in half, extend the bottom hemispheres, and scale down the top hemispheres using the FFD tool. Then I bridge the components together for seamless integration. At this stage, you can experiment with the symmetry by enlarging one eye relative to the other one for added character. Additionally, reducing the side count to 12 or 14 sides would be sufficient as the dragon's eyes are relatively small. I experiment with the scale tool to fill most available space on the corresponding plane. Typically, we don't want to combine elements that are really delicate with thick stylized geometry. The nose, like the eyes, has an excessive 16 sides, which could have been reduced to 12, 10 or even 8, matching the 8-sided hands. Lowering the side count frees up polygons for supporting loops, which are crucial for the model's curved features, particularly the horns. Similar to the dragon's eyes, you can break symmetry by adjusting the nostrils' curves and shapes for a more organic look. Once satisfied with the nose, I detach the main head's platform and use Proboline to merge it with the nose and other attachable elements. After noticing a height issue, I select all elements that should be flat, flatten them, and align them to a reliable vertex. Merging all components isn't necessary, it's simply my preferred pipeline. Allowing some intersecting details can save a modest amount of poly count. You can let objects intersect, but ensure they don't share vertices or planes to avoid Z-fighting. Working with flat surfaces simplifies merging when needed. Z-fighting occurs when two or more surfaces occupy almost the same space in a rendered image, and the rendering engine struggles to determine which surface should be drawn on top. This results in flickering, interference patterns, or incorrect depth sorting, as the engine rapidly switches back and forth between the competing surfaces. I aim for clean topology, minimizing angles and poles. Where they do exist, such as a few poles on static flat surfaces or some trees on similar planes, they are strategically placed to avoid issues. We get many vertices here that are positioned way too close to each other. We can either create additional circles around cylindrical intersections, or simply spread those vertices without stretching our polygons too hard. You can use the 3ds Max's XView tool to inspect the model for open edges that may result from improperly welded vertices. The teeth each have 6 sides, which could have been reduced to 5, though this has minimal impact. More critical are their curve, scale, and rotation. I position them along a pre-made spline, rotating them to angle backward for a flash-tearing appearance, and slightly inward to subtly cover the coffee nozzle. The teeth scale varies, with those farther from the center made smaller for a natural look. Next, I manually merge the bottom parts of the teeth with the rest of the head, ensuring proper vertex alignment. I select all surfaces and flatten them along the corresponding axis to correct any distortions. For the main nozzle, I create a small opening by chamfering a single vertex, tessellating the resulting square and removing it. I then apply the loop regularizer script to smooth the remaining edges. The nozzle has 8 sides, 2 supporting edges, though one would suffice, and 2 chamfers, which are optimal since the nozzle is rarely viewed closely. In fact, we could have copied one tooth after unwrapping it and make it intersect the jaw or simply hang below it. Then we could copy that tooth multiple times instead of increasing our poly count and UV space usage by embedding multiple teeth into the jaw. Once again, you can check your model for some open edges at this stage using the 3ds Max's Axio tool. Also, some mistakes were possible, so I simply flattened the surface that is supposed to be flat, just to make sure. Finally, I moved some vertices around, having the edge constraint function enabled. Make sure to make the coffee nozzle as thick as possible. We don't want to combine thick stylized geometry with delicate details. This may ruin the overall style of our model. Adding chamfers to the nozzle and also giving it 2 supporting edge loops seems like an overkill to me. If we want to be looking at it from the bottom side, we don't want to make it go too deep into the model. After creating a nozzle, I used the same method to create the attachment point for the hose we will add in the future. It doesn't require any chamfers obviously, as it is obscured from sight at all times. The rubber hose, built from a simple spline, has 8 sides. You can adjust its trajectory to emphasize the model's signature curves, but avoid excessive bending to minimize the need for additional supporting edges. To optimize, remove supporting geometry from hidden sides and add extra geometry to enhance visually prominent curves. Slightly bending the hose also helps break symmetry for a more organic look. If animation is planned, model the hose in a neutral pose, similar to a T-pose, to simplify rigging. Later use a bone system or your preferred animation method to stretch and bend it as needed. In order to attach the hose properly, I simply delete its ends and bridge the resulting geometry to corresponding openings of the model. As previously mentioned, the base tower's side count and number of battlements corresponds to the dragon's body side count. To reduce poly count, you can add triangles and collapse edges, but a more effective approach involves remodeling the dragon's neck to a lower side count, such as 12 sides, for better optimization. I manually rotate the top sides of battlements using the local coordinate system and apply a single chamfer to all tower elements for a polished look. Triangles are placed on flat surfaces to avoid impacting shading. Finally, I refine the model by applying a weighted normals modifier to enhance the overall appearance. At this stage, we could have created a high poly version of the model and sculpted the battlements for added detail. A simpler approach would be to manually adjust vertices to break up perfectly straight lines. However, I chose not to, as the model represents a used coffee machine rather than a weathered castle. The cup is, the cup. No idea what else I can say about it. I mean, it certainly doesn't have a handle. The hands are created as a NURMS object with the iteration count set to 1. Each hand and finger has 8 sides. Since the fingers aren't intended for animation, I pre-bend them to the desired pose. For a proper animation, a T-pose would be preferable to facilitate rigging. Both hands and fingers retain extra supporting edge loops to maintain smooth, visually prominent curves, as the model's visual fidelity relies on their smoothness. I didn't add supporting edges specifically for animation, as that would require a different pipeline, including a T-pose setup, a detachable button for interaction, and a quad-based topology for better head rotation and shaking. Instead of using a bone system, I bent the hands using the FFD modifier. Once satisfied with the hand's appearance, I added extra supporting edge loops to the tower and other elements to align with the model's overall curved aesthetic. At this stage, consider the functionality of a kitchen robot or coffee maker like this one. For instance, determine what the hands should reach. Can they pick up a cup from the table, place it somewhere, or add sugar independently? These tasks require planning the hand length and range of motion in advance. Since I don't plan to animate this model, I didn't account for these factors. I've also added the curved base to the tower, making it look a bit like a chess figure. Just make sure to not overextend with the amount of supporting edge loops here. The button has 16 sides, which is definitely an overkill. Still, it's a noticeable visually prominent element that stands out, so I don't think we should have gone below 12 sides. Inner details could have been baked, but I generously added a couple of loops to push the middle of the top surface down just a bit to make a viewer want to press it. If you want to animate the button later, you may want to detach it from the frame and the rest of your model. I noticed that the dragon lacked horns, so I created them using the loft modifier, defining their trajectories with simple splines. Initially, I made them symmetrical, but in retrospect, slightly altering one horn or trimming its tip could add more character to the dragon. The horns have 12 sides, which is excessive. 8 sides, as used for the dragon's hands, would suffice. After creating the initial spline, I move it outside the loft to view both the loft and the spline clearly. Typically, choose a cylinder for the loft with the same side count as the base object it will attach to. If the base object has a high side count, you can either reduce the sides and regularize the geometry, or create a flat intersection using triangles. I only model one horn and then set its pivot point to match the pivot point of the head and mirror the horn to the other side of the dragon. Remember that mirroring objects sometimes results in flipped normals that get fixed by either resetting your normals or resetting the model's X-form. Make sure to save your file before messing with X-form though. This part is universal, so I'll repeat most of the things I've mentioned in my previous videos. When it comes to final adjustments and checks, I group my objects, parent them to the central coffee maker, set its pivot point to the bottom of its middle part, and place the whole group to 000 scene coordinates. Then I use a selection panel to scan my meshes for remaining angons. Technically, you can also remove poles and make sure there aren't many vertices that connect 6 or more edges. Next, I use the 3ds Max's X-View tool to scan my model for some overlapping or isolated vertices and open edges. Once again, I've checked the fact that my objects intersect each other properly and don't share some planes or vertices. I've also reset the scale, rotation and X-form of most elements and set their pivot points manually, remembering their proper initial rotation angles. If you used mirroring or symmetry while modeling, it's especially important to reset the X-form of your model and make sure there are no flipped normals remaining. Just make sure to save your file before resetting the X-form. Finally, I proceed to assign my smoothing groups. There's nothing special about it, but once you are done, you can also apply the weighted normals modifier to your model. Just make sure to set smoothing groups meticulously, and mind that they will impact unwrapping. Normally, hard edges require corresponding UV splits for padding, but UV splits do not require hard edges. Hard edge placement is about controlling low poly smoothing behavior and baked normal gradation. UV seam placement is about optimizing usable texture space, while also limiting texture distortion. Bringing the two together is about balancing visual quality with resource efficiency. Using fewer hard edges and UV splits tend to be more resource efficient, but it's also important to make sure the final product looks good. It's generally considered best practice to strategically pair and place hard edges and UV seams along natural breaks in the shapes. Normally you can avoid sharp angles and hard edges by beveling, chamfering those edges and going with everything smooth. It means more polygons but less drastic gradients on the low poly shading for the normal map to compensate when baked. To further improve shading on beveled low poly meshes, you can use weighted normals. My model doesn't have any transparent elements, so I've unwrapped it to a single 2K Reso UV map with a padding of 16. That's pretty generous for a non-hero asset, especially considering the fact we use normals but don't bake anything. It may work for some indie project, but the real production grade thing would require some sculpted and hand-painted details and much more optimization. After all, we want to pull the maximum of existing UV maps. My model is relatively simple, so I've split my UVs according to existing hard edges and added some seams manually. Next I simply exploded all cylinders and straightened everything I could straighten in Rizom, except for cones and curved parts. Make sure to straighten holes for obvious reasons. Also, we want to straighten horns to paint stripes on them, the way their ends actually match and stripes loop properly. At some point we want to normalize our UV chucks and rescale some of them manually, considering their proportions in comparison to proportions of neighboring elements. I perform manual scaling to allocate more texture space to visually prominent elements. Conversely, I reduce the size of UV chucks that will be obscured or less visible during typical use. When adjusting UV island sizes, make sure to maintain relative proportions within the same object. It's generally good practice to keep UV size variations within 20% of neighboring elements. Always scale UV islands uniformly per element. Any uneven scaling will create visible seams that Substance Painter can't fix, no matter what tricks you try. I unwrapped the model to ensure no overlapping UV elements. In retrospect, stacking the UVs for the teeth and rear spines could have saved space, but I didn't pursue it. This approach would be most effective for independent teeth that intersect the upper jaw without being embedded into the head. The final thing I do in Max is explode the model. I pull all elements of my coffee machine to different sides, so that they don't affect each other when baking ambient occlusion. Also, I've noticed that I didn't assign some smoothing groups properly, so I've fixed that in 3ds Max and reapplied the weighted normals modifier. When baking my model, I set the highest possible amount of raise on all tabs, disabled the ID section and switched my subsampling to 16. I've also made sure that there were no purple lines on my model or some red fragments. Also, I've selected the option to use my low poly model as a high poly one during baking. My texturing process went pretty lazy. We would get a maximum of this model if we actually hand-painted it, but I mostly relied on some preset smart materials, particularly the slightly modified version of a plastic glossy stained preset smart material. At some point you may want to switch its projection method to triplanar, that will hide most visible UV seams. After that, I've played a bit with its roughness and layer opacity settings. I've also created multiple versions of this folder and used them to color various parts of my model, and only then brought them together, making them dimmer and darker with time. Finally, I've added some bright scratches and reduced their height ever so slightly to both highlight our edges and make our model look weathered and used. Remember to block out your colors first and only bring them together when you see a reference image, a pre-made color palette, or your model in general. This is much easier than trying to match colors one by one. I've removed some parts of the video where I pick colors. It took me long enough. It is also much easier to use dark and dim colors if you are a beginner than to properly pick bright ones. I didn't see many UV seams, so there were no need to cover them with a paint layer and a clone stamp tool this time. For stripes to work correctly, I flattened all hoses and horns in Rizom, as if they were perfect cylinders. Make sure to rotate your environment and alter your lighting settings now and then to see how your model performs in different environments. The belly was painted with another version of the plastic glossy stained smart material that had its height value reduced slightly. I've used the Follow Along Path tool and a fill layer to paint its borders, and used a different fill layer to paint its insides while using the Filled Path tool. For grunges, I mainly relied on scratched edges, dirt leaks, and ground dirt smart masks. The main idea behind them was to edit the layer transparency settings the way they blend perfectly with the rest of the model. I think this covers everything I wanted to mention. Thanks for watching, guys. If my videos are of use to you, be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day!